We are beginning our lecture series with lecture 1 and 2 here in this particular presentation. So the way the Bardach book is set up, it's not in chapters, but it's in parts. So there are 3 main parts, and the first part is what we'll see in this lecture. Keep in mind that for week 1, all you need to know is the first half of the first part, and then for lecture 2 or week 2, you'll look at the second half. But of course, it's all here, so why not just look at it all in one sitting? But just for the sake of quizzes and things like that, the first half is what you should be concerned with for week 1. So we're here to learn about how to design an excellent research project. Through the eightfold path to policy analysis, this is how we will learn to do that. Um, a lot of, well, some of you might find some of this very intuitive. You may have done this in the past, and that's wonderful. And maybe you'll still learn a thing or two in this process. So that's great. Um, steps 1 to 4 focus on the framing of the research project, the analysis, framing it out. The second 4 steps emphasize doing, actually conducting the analysis. Okay. The undesired gap between the as is condition and the to be condition. The most important policy problems are ill-constructed, wicked problems that are difficult to resolve. It is important to note that if you misdiagnose the problem, the policy solution is likely to fail. So this is a very critical step. Step 1 should not be overlooked, should not be done too quickly, right? Because the way you define the problem could end up being the way, could end up making or breaking the solution, right? So it is more than just defining goals and measuring distance from those goals. It's about strategic representation of the situation for favored course of action by interested groups. Okay? So it's very political. The way you define the problem, it determines how the solutions are going to come to be. And so understanding that the definition of the problem has to be evaluative, the problem has to be quantifiable. So what is the problem? How do we measure that problem? People, whether you know this or not, like to be measured. Record keeping stimulates reporting. So you start counting, and it almost that by virtue of you being counted, by virtue of something being measured, it stimulates change. So treat the conditions that cause the problem also as the problem. Okay, so as we're thinking about the problem, we're thinking a little further, a little deeper about some of the conditions, right, that cause this problem to even be. Missing such an opportunity is also a problem, because you might get to the problem, forget the root of the problem, and so you're constantly dealing with a problem instead of hitting it at the root. Okay, defining the problem can also be very iterative, because you're going back to the source, so the source might change every now and again, and so it's important to not get frustrated, but to understand that it is iterative. So again, like I said, counting is political. Numbers don't speak for themselves. Numbers create alliances between those who are measured and those who are the measurers. Power to measure gives power to control. What does that mean? That means that you, as a policy analyst, you as a problem definer, have some control, have some power. Okay, numbers create illusion of simplicity. Very important here, and we will look at this even further when we start looking at the actual numbers in the second half of the semester. Numbers create illusions of simplicity in complex problems. They do simplify things, or so we think. Ambiguous numbers leaves the scope for political interpretation, so very true. Measuring implicitly creates norms and entitlements, and measuring acknowledges frequent occurrence. Now we know that, but some of the things I said prior, very important because it's political. Create the problem, to communicate the problem to the audience, you need to be sure that there is evidence that the problem does indeed exist. So this evidence should be strong enough to make your audience care about the problem and want to read further about solutions to address the problem. Okay? So in step 2, we need to think about so many different things before we collect the data. And we need to, as we're thinking about the source, right, from that definition step, defining the problem, as we think about that, it should be coming to our mind, how do we want to collect this data? Who might be able to provide good evidence? Where do we locate these relevant sources, these relevant resources? Are they documents? Are they people? Let's distinguish between supportive documents and essential practices. So the also distinguish between secondhand information. Okay, primary information, you heard it from the horse's mouth, right? Secondary information, you're relying on what someone has told you someone else said. Okay? Secondary information. Some examples of secondary information, let's see. The US Census can be considered secondary information when you're using it, right? Some of these data sets that we will see in the second half of the semester when we start crunching numbers, secondhand information. You don't know those people. You didn't collect that data, but it's secondhand because they've done all the work for you, and now you just get to use the data that they've created and provided to you. Secondhand information. Okay, now you going out to collect the data firsthand, right? You going out and doing the interview firsthand information. Okay, and there needs to be multiple sources of firsthand information. Okay, multiple sources of information, period. Okay, but and so I shouldn't say just firsthand, but multiple sources of information. There's a such thing called triangulating, which essentially means that all of your sources should all still lead to one conclusion. Okay? And that's why we get multiple sources. If they don't lead to one conclusion, something's wrong. Okay? Someone's not telling the full story or whatever it might be. Okay? So think about, how do you gain access? How do you seeking appointments and interviews? So searching for sources, people who have the subject matter information that you need. Okay, step 2 is also very important when we're thinking about the problem, because we have to do this early. We have to do this early because if you don't collect your data early enough, you might not have any footing, right, to even move forward. Assembling your evidence is essentially your key into moving forward. It might be what you need, right? This step 2 might allow you to actually do the project. You might need grant money. And if you provide enough evidence, right, that you can collect the data that this problem actually exists, then you might be able to move on with funding. with constructing the alternatives, alternatives offer ways to address or to eliminate the problem, the policy problem in our situation. In constructing alternatives, one can utilize several techniques. Copy an existing policy without modifying it at all. You can copy an existing policy and modify it to fit your needs. You can build a policy utilizing generic tools. Okay, you can build a policy from scratch with creativity and brainstorming. Alternatives should be tightly linked to your problem definition, specific enough to be actionable. It's really important that your alternatives are actionable, okay? Because if you have an alternative that you can't act upon, that is just a matter of fact alternative, like the grass is green. Well, thank you. How do I act on that? Or what should I do with that information? Versus the grass is too long and needs to be cut, right? Actionable. It needs to be relevant to your client's resources. Can your client actually do something with this? Right? Not only is it actionable, but is it feasible? Does it seem like something that can be done, particularly to or by the people in which you're presenting it to? And materially different from one another. So this alternative A shouldn't be the same thing as alternative B. These alternatives should be in and of themselves unique. Okay, you should try to include at least 3 to 5 alternatives, and at least one of these should be a do-nothing option. It's possible that we have all of these solutions, or we have a problem, right? And we have come up with all these solutions, and one of them is possibly, there's nothing we can do about it. Sad, but that's the reality of our world, right? It is important not to choose dummy alternatives or pick a favorite alternative, as this will disrupt the analysis process, the validity and the reliability. We'll talk about this later, but the validity and reliability of your analysis. Okay, so we think big. Think big as we're starting to construct our alternatives. Think big picture. Okay, think comprehensively. And from there, we need to start tunnel visioning. We need to start narrowing down till we get to more focused alternatives. Okay? All right. This week at least. And this criteria are used to measure the outcomes and the impacts of each alternative. So you've come up with alternatives. Now let's think about what the possible impacts are, what could possibly come of each of these alternatives, right? So Bardach describes them as the mental standards for evaluating the results of action. Okay, we take the time to do a mental exercise of, what could be? What if we did this, what would happen? What if we did that, what would happen? Okay, and so the criteria should be measurable, right? Quantifiable, because how else are we going to know whether they're quote unquote good or bad? So there are several criteria commonly utilized by policy analysts, and here I've provided 7. Efficacy. Is it effective? Is it useful? If the problem is this and the alternative is this, does it help us alleviate that problem? That's what efficacy is. Is it effective in alleviating, addressing, eliminating the problem? Equity. Equity is really important, not equity on a mortgage, but equity in terms of, is everyone better off? Okay? Equality is different from equity. Why? Equality talks about I gave this person 2, I gave this person 2, so this person also gets 2. That's equality. But equity is, well, I gave this person 2. This person already had 2, so he didn't need any, so we're good. And this person had 1, so I gave him 1. So now everybody's got 2. Yay, nobody's worse off. Equity. Okay? So we try to measure our alternatives, the outcomes of our alternatives, based on equity. Really important thing, really important tool that a lot of times gets overlooked. We think about efficiency, we think about efficacy, and we forget and we fail to think about the least of these, which helps us. The least of these, at least the Bible talks of the least of these in quotations, which is the most vulnerable people. Okay? Equity. So efficiency. Next on our plate, it's helping us to understand, we get to measure whether we're getting more output for our input. We put into it, what we put into it, are we getting, we're trying to, as businesses try to do, get more bang for the buck. That's what efficiency is all about. Am I getting more bang for my buck? Okay, cost, here's that buck. How much does it cost? How much will it cost? Now we're now looking at all of our different alternatives, at the outcomes of them, and we're trying to see, okay, which one's going to cost more, which one's going to cost less, right? And then we've got 2 levels of feasibility here. We've got administrative feasibility, which means, is this even possible to be done, right? Can the doers of this do it? And then we've got political feasibility. While it can be done, is it something that's going to politically fly? Will the powers that be allow it to happen? Will the vote actually go through? Or will it be that Republicans or Democrats cannot agree on it? So even though this is something that we can administratively get done totally, politically it's not going to happen because they will not agree, right? Because it might be swayed to once, it might be swayed to one side more so than the other. Maybe for a social policy, right? Democrats would vote yes on it, whereas the Republicans would say absolutely not, right? It might be administratively feasible, but politically it's just not going to fly. Okay, so these are the criteria, and the last one, sustainability. This allows us to measure, is this something that can be maintained? Is this something that will last for generations, right? Is this a quick fix that will have to come and quick fix again and again and again, or can it stand on its own for a while? All right, so moving on. To highlight the following that you can extract obviously from the previous slide, but I just want to talk about it also here. Fairness is important when we're talking about efficacy and efficiency and leaving out equity. We need to think about fairness. Does it invoke correct, complete, and precise rules and enforce effectively and predictably, right? Eliminating arbitrariness, okay? Does it take rights seriously? So this is something you want to think about for all of your alternatives, okay? Freedom. Is it freedom of markets? I know that's a major thing for sort of the laissez-faire groups, the people who are fiscally conservative, business owners, business doers. They are very much concerned about market freedom. Okay, is there economic freedom, religious freedom, freedom of speech, of privacy, and so on? So we think about fairness. Let's think about freedom as well. Let's think about security. And you can see at the bottom here, I talk about I list out the different forms of security, whether it's border security or food security. There are some places, some people, some communities that don't have food security, right? Home security, um, all kinds of forms of security. Okay, and then I talked about this already, but legality versus political acceptability. And then finally, the robustness of the plan, of the alternative. How can it stand? Can it stand on its own? Is it sturdy enough? Is there anything that needs to be improved? Is there how is the improvability of it? Can we tweak it a little bit more? Okay, so that's our step 4. Excuse me. And the criteria that, these are the criteria. This slide and the previous slide are the criteria that will enable you as a policy analyst to evaluate each alternative across the same metric in order to ultimately determine the best policy option. Therefore, criteria should be chosen based on outcomes and impacts that policy leaders would like to see for a particular policy option. Is to project the outcomes. So evaluate each policy alternative based on the criteria. Sometimes this process will enable you to clearly eliminate policy alternatives that do not produce desired outcomes and impacts. However, it is often difficult to pinpoint the most effective policy alternative from this process. Okay, but this process is very important because it helps you to streamline, to start narrowing down, because we have this big grand scope of things that we could possibly do, and we need to start allowing ourselves to narrow down. Okay. So, one thing I want to point out about this step is that you have to have some analysis, wow, I can't talk, analyzing ability. You have to have some statistical tools to be able to even get very deep in step 5. Okay, there's projection modeling that you could do. There's break-even analyses, sensitivity analyses. These are things that I have gone into federal agencies to teach people who are in positions of authority to make decisions, and they don't even have these tools. And so giving them these to me, what I consider basic tools for decision making, being able to crunch some numbers and see, okay, this is really what would happen if we have 5,000 people in this particular project, and and you literally create a model that provides all, and you provide all the evidence to back up that model, and it allows you to now say, this is the outcome that we can project would happen. Okay, so these listed here are the various different ways of coming up with step 5, where you project your outcomes, where you predict your outcomes. Next is confronting the trade-offs. Now that you've actually taken the time to come up with your alternatives, to assess use a criteria to assess your alternatives, and now to do some basic number crunching and decide and see what your potential outcomes could be, now we confront the trade-offs as a clear policy winner. Okay. Is often not produced from the above analysis. It is important to look at trade-offs between the policy alternatives to identify the best alternative. This includes conducting a cost-benefit analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, it's a little different, or a multi-attribute analysis. Ultimately, you should be able to produce 2 to 3 crystal clear sentences on what your clients get and what your clients get and what your clients give up from choosing a certain policy alternative. Okay, so we are seeing our outcomes, and we are now literally placing before us alternative A, B, and C. Maybe those are the top three after you've done step 5. Okay, you're placing them before you, and you are literally writing the positive for all of them, the negatives for all of them. You add them up. That's how I like to do it. And you say, okay, which one weighs more now? Which one has the most cost? Which one has the greater benefit? All of that. Okay, which one is more effective? Reminding ourselves of step 1, what the problem is. Which one is more effective at getting to that problem? Okay. So all this is important as we continue to make our way down into actually making a decision. Well, now we just make our decision. Woo! Okay. So as we've gone through steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we've done it to the absolute best of our ability, we are now at step 7, where we can choose a policy alternative not based off of our, oh, I had a dream. No, based on actual analysis that we have taken part in, that we have conducted ourselves, that allows us to stand firmly on whatever our policy alternative, whatever we decide on. Okay? If you can't decide or you are uncertain, your trade-off exercise is not yet complete. If you can't convince yourself, you won't convince others. Okay? So rational analytical model is the key to arriving at decisions to deliver on policy goals and objectives. So a rational analytical model, something that we have just done in step 5 and in step 6, that allows us to stand firmly, right, logically, and not just whimsically on whatever decision we are taking. Okay, we have rules of argument with several of them. Arguments by example. Give more than one example of why this is the reason for your decision. Use representative examples. Okay, I would not use an example of my cousins in Nigeria to explain why people in New Mexico do this, that, or the other. Someone would say, how is that even relevant? Okay. So I might use you guys as an example to explain how undergrads do this, that, or the other, right? That might be a little bit more representative. Background information is crucial, right? But guess what? You have done your due diligence, steps 1 to 6. You've done that. And so your background information hopefully is very solid. Okay? Consider counterexamples. This is really critical because I have seen, and I've been in this situation where I didn't take the time to think, well, what are all the possible questions or perspectives, on this particular matter, because I might be looking at it from cup half full and someone else from cup half empty. And so you have to be able to see your 360 around this problem. So give examples, give a counter examples, give analogies, okay? Similar examples. Using relatively similar examples to draw analogies, okay, to make comparisons. That's what that essentially means. Arguments by authority, okay, cite sources. You don't have to stand on this by yourself. Look for resources that confirm what you have come up with or what you are arguing. Seek informed sources, all right? Not just literature reviews. Maybe there is a researcher out there that has a YouTube video on this, okay? He or she's a researcher. Okay, use that informed source. Or maybe it's someone that's out in the field that does this work with their nonprofit. Use that resource. Use an impartial source. Okay? That can often be the informed researcher. Okay? It might not necessarily be the nonprofit director who has possibly, and not automatically, obviously, might be partial, might not be partial. Political views can tend to be very partial. Cross-check your resources. If so-and-so said this, look in another resource and see, does it match up? That cross-checking is what I mentioned at the very beginning, or closer to the beginning, where I talked about triangulating. Your resources, your sources need to all, wherever they're coming from, need to all lead to the same conclusion. Okay? Personal attacks do not disqualify sources. Okay? That doesn't help, but it doesn't disqualify. Okay? Arguments about causes. Explain how cause leads to effect. Explain it. Use your words. As I tell my sweet love, my husband, use your words. He's awesome, by the way. So let me not even, because he actually is an amazing person and knows how to use his words, but sometimes he's at a loss of words. But that's awesome, too, because it's cute. Propose the most likely cause. Don't give the one that, no one would have thought about that. Give the most prominent one, okay? If this is your argument and you're making a case, don't go with the weak one. Go with the strong one. Correlated causes are not necessarily related. Correlated events may have common causes, possibly. And then causes may be complex. It could very well be complex because this is the real world. This is not a Disney movie. So it could very well be a very, very wicked problem. And if you're not familiar with the term wicked just means extremely complex and extremely just it's wicked. It's like, wow, where do we even start to tackle this? Okay? And you, madam, you, sir, are working your way towards mastering the process of policy analysis, not necessarily the process of solving wicked problems, because even experts are here working to solve wicked thoughts here, lots of thoughts here. Be clear, consider all objectives. A lot of similar things I'm saying, but I understand that people understand it differently. You can say tomato and someone says tomato, and now tomato makes a lot of sense, and tomato, someone was squinting their eyes trying to figure out what you're saying. So here it is again, in a different way, and whatever floats your boat, let it float. All right, finally. You tell your story. In recounting the process to the client, it is important to clearly tell the story. Trade detail for brevity. You should consider 3 types of audiences. Those that will spend 30 seconds reading your analysis. That's what we call that elevator speech. You want to be sure that you have one in your pocket just to throw out when you need it. Okay? Elevator speech, 30 seconds. Okay? Of this is the story, this is the problem, this is the synopsis, this is what I think we should do. Can we do it? Right? That's one type of audience. The second, those who you will spend 3 minutes with. Okay, so you can give a little bit more detail. Obviously not too much because 3 minutes. And then those you can spend 30 whole solid minutes with. how would you talk to each of them about everything from steps 1 to 7? Okay, your analysis should provide enough information to satisfy all 3 types of readers. Amen. And enable them to understand your process and ultimate recommendation. Okay? So again, think about yourself, your client, your audience. Be true to yourself, okay? Speak in a way that your client can understand, your audience has time to receive. Okay? Speak their language. Okay? What medium are you going to use? That's essentially saying, is it a PowerPoint? Be prepared for that. Is it just verbalizing it? Okay? Is it in written form? Is it aesthetically pleasing in written form? In PowerPoint, in a Word document, is it pleasing to the eye? Because if it's too cluttered, maybe someone like me won't care to read it. Okay? Or too many words, versus maybe you should have added a graph or a picture here and there. Okay? Follow logical narrative of the story. Notice I didn't go from step 1 to step 5 and said, oh, well, let me go back to step 2. I want to talk about that a little. Well, let me jump over to step 8 and then, well, okay, well, something had happened, so let me just... No. So be logical in your narrative. Be chronological if possible, but be logical. Okay, sensible about how it came to be and how you present it. Okay. All right. And also be sure to put your citations. You don't want to be caught with a plagiarism. What's the word? Alleged plagiarism or whatever slapped on you. So I hope this helps. And read more in the book for greater context, because that's what the book is for. I'm just here to provide my lovely voice and to give you snapshots of what the book offers in much, much greater detail and clarity. Are transparent. I say that because in the society we live in, you might tell half a truth, and that's to me a lie, but to someone else just half a truth. So transparency is really important, and transparency can help reduce the scope of discretion, since decisions are more likely to be reached on the basis of observable data and replicable methods. And poor decisions will be more open to challenge. Okay, transparency can also increase the legitimacy of decisions, thereby reducing the risk of future policy reversals, anticipation of which will tend to undermine the intended response. So you're already being half-truthy, you're already being not as transparent as you should be. And what this sentence is saying is that it will cause you to always wonder, oh gosh, when is this going to be disclosed? When are people going to discover that? Thereby causing you heartburn and headache that you could otherwise just resolve to not, or decide to not have to deal with, if you are just completely transparent and not worrying about, is this going to get overturned once they find out what's really behind this policy. Okay, I say that because this is actually a very very prominent thing in our society. In the law world, they are taught, I would say, to speak in a way that is so ambiguous and so broad in scope. This speaks to the first bullet point here. It's so broad in scope that anyone can interpret it anyhow that they want to, and no one ends up being wrong for it. But that's what causes the overturn later, because a Democratic person or a Republican person might say, well, that's not how we wanted that policy to be implemented. Well, the policy was created and passed in with such broad language that allowed everyone and anyone to be okay with it, because, oh, I can see my vision in that. Oh, I can see my vision in that. Everyone can see their vision in it. And then now here it comes down to the administrative level. Politically, it's been passed because of the broadness of the policy, and now administratively, depending on whoever's in power, they get to implement it however they so see fit. And so if a political person has appointed another conservative or another less conservative or a liberal person into office, guess what? That policy is going to be implemented as very, very conservative or very liberal. So transparency works even when incentives cannot. Just be open, be honest, and see what happens. All right, read your books, and good luck on your quiz. Bye.